friends. Welcome back to Club. My name is Jess, and today we're joined by Austin Robey, C Club alum, collaborator, creator of Ampled and DinnerDAO, and a number of fun, interesting explorations at the intersection of co-ops and Web3, and that's what we dive into here. His most recent post on the FWB media publication teased apart the differences between co-ops and DAOs and how they overlap and intersect in many ways. So we talk about the challenges and benefits that come from both co-ops and DAOs. We talk about how tokens can act as a tool to bootstrap a network effect and create true collective ownership. We talk about ownership more generally and how Austin believes it should be a cultural value that we prioritize, and asks ourselves, who owns this product a little more often than we do? Austin always challenges my thinking, helps me see the world in a bit of a different light, and I think you'll find this conversation valuable. So let's get into it. Austin, welcome to Club. How you doing, my friend?
What's up, Jess? Glad to be on the internet with you.
Yes, this has been, we've already had to get a few giggle fits out of the way due to a number of unrelated situations here, but I'm glad we're here for business. This is a very important conversation, Austin. Every single one of our conversations is very important. And actually, I'm kind of being facetious, but I'm actually really looking forward to this one. So you and I, we go way back, in, at least in Web3 terms, back to SCO2, where you were one of the early participants with your project Ampled, which is a cooperative in the music space. And I'm going to let you get into all of that. I've always enjoyed our conversations because I think you come at it from a really interesting angle, and obviously we're going to get into that. And also you've recently published a piece that I think has really struck a nerve, as we were talking about earlier. So interested in this intersection of cooperatives and DAOs, and I have a feeling this is going to be a really big area of discussion over the next weeks, months, and years. So really stoked to get into it with you, who I think is probably amongst the deeper thinkers in this space for sure. So Austin, who are you, and give us a bit of context before we jump into the nitty gritty.
I laugh at the thought of me being a deep thinker in this space, but I remember the first time talking to you, I was actually very distant from anything crypto related. I was very clear, not crypto native. I think the entrance point is what I found is interesting is there's many different entrance points that people can start at and kind of end up in the same place, end up in the same communities, end up in the same rooms and conversations. Yeah, I mean, my journey, at least landing into Web3, was thinking about collective ownership of tech, cooperatives, cooperative platforms, specifically the platform cooperativism movement, which kind of rooted in academia, but has had practitioners tinkering away at this for a minute. As I kind of mentioned, I think it's important to note, in that FWB piece, this is a term that actually has come before Ethereum. This is an idea space that has existed before thinking about all the things that ETH can do or what we're seeing in this ecosystem. But yeah, there's a lot of overlapping conversations, which some people might not see, or I think people are slowly seeing that there's real conversations about real collective ownership. And it's with these conversations are happening with people that, we're not part of the platform cooperativism movement, but still kind of see collective ownership as this cultural virtue that we should care about and we should work towards. And so I think that people are just trying to figure out what's the best way to do that. And I'm kind of the mind now that Web3 tooling is probably one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like I've been a part of that entire, in piecemeal, at least the entire sort of shift as you've sort of stepped in and done a variety of different roles in the space. But take me back to Ampled and what you were trying to achieve there, what it was, and maybe how that relates to, maybe that sets the tone for some of our other conversations here today.
Yeah, Ampled, it's a web platform. It's kind of like a Patreon for musicians, formed and operated as a cooperative. That means one member, one vote, owned by the artists and workers. Started it in a very intentional way of not taking any VC investment. Not that VCs were fighting to invest in it anyways, but no VCs, no investor ownership at all, actually. We did have some friends invest money, but we even took the time to create our own investment terms that were revenue share loans, just to preserve all the ownership. So there was no asterisk. We could just say it's 100% owned by the artists and workers. And yeah, that started actually not as a background of being a cooperative historian or cooperative advocate. I actually hadn't even been a member of a cooperative before starting Ampled. I think we were just really exploring, me and Colin Lewis as the co-founder of Ampled, and we we're just exploring what are things that we could do that feel right to us, that would be unique and like can build trust into the organization. So when we kept thinking about it, it's like, we can't just ask people to trust us. I think it shouldn't rely on people's personalities or goodwill or good intentions. Something structural should make you trust something. And it ended up boiling down to this question of ownership. That seemed like an interesting question. Can we share ownership? And I looked at a lot of different mechanisms. Turns out it's not that easy. It's not that easy to just say everyone's an owner now. So yeah, at first, I think we viewed cooperatives and tech together as a very impractical combination. Sure, it sounds great, but like you probably would need VCs to get it off the ground. And maybe there even is some truth to that, to be honest. But I think we just ended up landing on just saying like, oh, let's try it. This feels right to us. We have no idea how we would fundraise this platform, but saying there's no exit, there's no way to cash out. We thought about like, let's build something because we think it should exist, not because of a financial payout. Build something for a use case value rather than a transactional value. And I think like that spirit did resonate and carry with people. Yeah, a lot of that landing on that decision was discovering articles and opinions from academia, from like Trevor Scholes at New School, these ideas of platform cooperatives. And some of the early examples are just super interesting. So I think, we followed in the footsteps of people like Stocksy, Savvy Cooperative, Resonate, others that are like, we're really important in this idea space. And we just, pursued it in our own way.
So yeah, I love it. I mean, I think my journey into the space was similar in root, but very different in practice. And like I was very early into social media and sort of pulled into that Web 2 hype or promise, I guess, this idea of democratized distribution, and also saw it fall down earlier than most, I think, which is like, investing in the simplest way, investing into the creation of like building a Facebook page or a YouTube channel, and then seeing the sort of the platform start to move away from supporting the growth of those channels to extracting value from those channels through advertising, et cetera. And that idea of like not having an ownership stake in the networks that I think were going to be part of like a major shift in our economy just seemed really messed up to me, and like a negative version of the future. So I sort of came into crypto as tokens equal ownership in digital networks. It sounds like you came through it sort of the creation of a cooperative lens. Tell me a little bit about how you were thinking about, or like, how did you get into Web3 through the lens of Ampled?
It felt like a way to explore, a way to give these ideas a better chance of surviving and impacting more people. So some of the challenges that cooperatives face is we tried getting grants, written a lot of grant applications, very few responses. Some of the challenges are cooperatives are inherently for-profit organizations, so many grants are constrained to giving to nonprofits, which technically have no ownership whatsoever, rather than collective shared ownership. And if you're not selling ownership to investors, it becomes very difficult to raise money. So there's just this problem, this like capital conundrum. Everyone that's like a cooperative entrepreneur, however small that group is, faces. And at the Platform Cooperative Conference in 2019, there was a panel on this of how to fund these cooperative platforms. And on stage, there was no one that had funded a cooperative platform or had raised money for a cooperative platform. And I just thought about that compared to like TechCrunch, who would have been on stage for that same conversation at that group. And so there's clearly frustrating challenges of people like really desperately needing financial resources to see some of these ideas through. It's where a lot of them get stuck. It's funny that like the Web3 space doesn't have any of those problems. Generally speaking, like can move on to like meatier problems like once you get past that. But yeah, I mean, in Ampled, thinking about it, it's like, we always struggled to find funding. We were lucky enough to pick off a few grants here or there, but it still is, to this day, it's a labor of love pet project. It's a dozen or more people work together on it because they really enjoy working on it. I was asking, like, I could see examples of projects that seemed really effective at bootstrapping with this idea of a token that represents a contribution to a network and something that like can actually be imbued with real value and allow for like a global group of people that support the idea to align with it in some way. Yeah, I was exploring like how that could work. Could a cooperative have a token? Maybe it could exist alongside meat space equity, but like represent something else. Early days thinking like, could this even be like community currency type thing? And all the contributors of Ampled, we've been measuring our hours that we put into the project from the beginning. So there's a spreadsheet that shows how many hours everyone's put in since the beginning of the project. People that have come in, people that have gotten busy or gotten other jobs and have stepped away. So it's like 20 people in all their hours. And I just look at it and think this could be like a direct one-to-one relation with an airdrop eventually. It lends itself really well, I think, especially as like the models have developed and there's beginning to be some best practices of how it could work. The way that we've set it up, yeah, it's just a question, could it work? Could it work and could it be a way to resource this thing, which has been really hard to do?
And so where did you end up? Because I think that is a core question so many of us ask in the space. One of the interesting things is you had this thing, right? You had this existing organization, its structure, the legal structure, a very clear set of values, approaches, and formal structures that you kind of had to play within. And so to me, that was really interesting, right? Thinking not only from like similar in concept, but very different in origin. And I thought there'd be some really interesting insights that came from that. So yeah, take us through sort of either current thinking or where you guys got to with the Ampled token.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And as you've probably maybe seen, I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I feel like the more you already have existing structurally, it feels harder to grind those gears backwards sometimes. And at the core and heart of Ampled is the community. It's a feeling of ownership. And there's so much work. Launching a token is really hard. It's a lot of work. It's a ton of education. It's a lot of community support. It's a lot of technical work too. And designing it is not trivial. And I think for us, it really just boiled down to like understanding how much work that is and me being ready to go for it. I wouldn't say there was a high enough threshold of people like pushing behind me for it. And that could have been like a lack of understanding. It could have been like me not articulating it enough, people not ready. But also, I'm very sensitive to not wanting to violate the trust of this community and making sure that it's not one person pushing for something. So in the end, I would say that it's still on ice. I mean, it could happen. I think that there was and continues to be like about as thorough of like a exploration as you could be for how something like this could work. And yeah, I mean, if anyone else listening is interested in the co-op intersection, like I'm happy to share notes on kind of like our journey.
Yeah. So I mean, there's actually a lot in that I want to unpack. And I totally agree. I think transitioning an existing organization into a tokenized one is just very hard and generally don't recommend it, or at least there's a number of reasons why doing something sort of parallel or side. You know, I often talk about acting like a speakeasy or using the speakeasy method, right? Which is pull the can of Coke on the wall and all of a sudden the door opens and you're into this other part, and it creates a sort of a separation from the core business. Deeper to that is this idea of understanding the responsibility and effort required to successfully launch one of these tokens. And I think the project leaders that I'm most excited to work with, and I think we see represented in C Club across the board, are folks who are extremely, extremely sensitive to and aware of their responsibility to the community and the desire to not just not violate that, but like grow that, foster that, to see like so much of the success is going to come from being able to do that successfully. And so, yeah, I think like the idea of pushing forward with a token, not only does that sort of violate our broader beliefs in the space, which is like that these things take a long time to work and you need to have people who are really committed to it, and that we shouldn't push anything forward, frankly, unless we have that sort of support. But also, yeah, and it almost like you're sort of recognizing the responsibility you have as a leader in that community as well, and that you could probably get it done and across the line, but is that really the right thing, especially where you started from? So I don't know. I think it's, I'm very.
Yeah, there was a lot of benefit of the doubt it could have gotten across the finish line. But yeah, it's a very serious undertaking of the community efforts. It takes at least months to just even understand the context of some of what things are relative to, say, like Bitcoin. Like that's like kind of like, what is ETH? What's Bitcoin? What's an ERC-20? Like that's something that actually takes a while, and only if people have dedicated time and want to dive into it.
Yeah, that's why we're focused on. You want to have 2 feet in Web3, or at least be trying to jump into that within your core team and community. I mean, I use Ampled as an example of something I'm very excited to see fostering within Seed Club, which is this very clear desire not to be a token foundry or factory. And I think I look at your decision, and the natural response from our community is like, yeah, great, perfect, right? Like I hope you didn't feel any pressure. I mean, I'm sure Tech didn't want to put any pressure on you to put something out there. And ultimately, I think what we see from that is that bigger, better, more interesting opportunities start to come up, right? And I think the more aligned opportunities come up, and those things that are going to actually be able to build for the long term. And as we're still so early in exploring this entire space, the idea of just trying to like force anything into existence just doesn't seem right. And I think part of that is we have this like flexibility and freedom right now where we are still early. We're in a position where we can bring resources to bear to actually have the time and freedom to like not have to focus on driving immediate bottom line attention for every single project that comes in. And a big part of that actually comes from what I think sounds like was sort of like the general weakness of the cooperative model, but is a very, very much the strength, with maybe some caveats, to the Web3 model, which is that people are far more willing, they see future value here and are far more willing to contribute, put capital, time, effort to work here. And so I'm curious, like maybe this is like a nice sort of pivot to core intention I had to bring you on the show, which is you have this article. I mean, I saw it in so many different directions. People are talking about it. It's posted on fwb.wip, Friends with Benefits website. It's called What Co-ops and DAOs Can Learn from Each Other. The best framework for coordinating and making a difference may not be a choice between the two models, but a blend of both. And so I think for folks listening, you can understand why Austin's probably one of the perfect people to write this article, and would love to get into it. My worldview is that the ideal outcome from tokens and crypto and Web3, whatever words we want to use for it, is that we can take the best parts of capitalism, which is like people willing to put risk capital up, folks who are willing to risk their time and effort and to invest in it, just like all the members of your co-op that leaned in can also benefit from it. And hopefully the best parts of collective ownership that comes from like individual users and members and people having a say and having an ownership stake in it. And at the root, that so much of these digital networks, so much of the value in these networks aren't necessarily the tech itself, but it's really like the network effect that's created based on this tech. So I think we have some interesting things, and maybe I'm pushing at maybe more of the capitalist side than you may be. I don't know where we'll start to end up there, but can you maybe just introduce the article? What led to you exploring this topic in writing?
Yeah, definitely don't want to get into a conversation defining capitalism, but yeah, having like one foot in both worlds, there's a lot to admire from both that I think maybe gets overlooked, and there's a lot of the same ideas being talked about, which, yeah, I think should ideally share some of the same tools. I mean, I don't think it has to be that much of a divide, as part of the thesis, that kind of like the ideology in cooperatives, the spirit of them, but also like the actual demonstrated global impact DAOs have had. It seems reasonable to me that could marry the best of both.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I feel like on the edges there are disagreements, or there's a feeling like there's a big divide, but I think so many of the folks that I interact with on a daily basis probably agree with most of what like they feel that sort of connection. There isn't such a big difference between those two worlds, though I think you do a great job in articulating that we're often speaking in different language and maybe not fully aware of the nuance of some of the differences there. So you do a great job of sort of breaking down the differences between DAOs and cooperatives. How should we think about those differences?
Well, I think there's technical differences and there's cultural differences. Primarily, one member, one vote. Basically the primary defining characteristic of a cooperative. You'll just hear people on one side just say, oh, that's impossible in Web3. There's no such thing as civil resistance, like. But at the same time, I also saw Friends with Benefits had a city leader election where everyone had the same voting power. When you actually have a community of humans, which is like when you colloquially refer to DAOs, like that's kind of like what a lot of people are talking about. It's like there's not really like that can be possible. So yeah, Friends with Benefits doing that election, that's taking a bit from like a cooperative playbook. Everyone has the same voting power. But I think what I outlined mostly was just some of the cultural differences. So I think what we've seen with Constitution DAO, I think like there's a now like general reflex of let's buy this, let's buy SeaWorld, let's buy a blimp. Like it's just a meme now. And like on one hand, I get it and I enjoy it. I participated in Constitution DAO as well, even though I publicly criticized it. Because also, like, the internet should be fun again. I feel like that's part of the goal of Web3. Get away from corporate monopolies and, like, just have fun. But if I had $40 million, buying a copy of the US Constitution would be nearly one of the last things to do with it. There's so many better things that can actually impact people, impact your neighborhood, what you see when you walk out of your front door, like people that are suffering. There's a lot better things to do. So like connecting that where cooperatives have spiritual roots is people working together to help themselves. When no one will build something for you, people get together and build it for themselves. It's been underdogs. Yeah, people that find greater chance at prosperity with solidarity. I think that connecting to more of that and less of the kind of like fun commoditization exercises is a good thing. And I think that might be why a decent amount of people connected with the article, because I think that we're at this point where it's like, okay, what's next? After like, let's buy SeaWorld, let's buy the Constitution, what's next? I think that a lot of people in the Web3 space saw that as a search or maybe like a validating something that was in the back of their mind. Maybe like we should search for more meaning, and that's something that like they've been wanting or wanting to see more of.
Yeah, the WAGBA movement I think is super interesting, and I think generally fast followers, you see many things happen and it kind of peters out very quickly. And I think you're right. People are looking for that next thing. And so Krause House is the team that we've been working with a lot at C Club. The interesting part of that is to me less about the buying of the team and it's more about the end operating. Like I think to me that sort of ongoing value creation really it gets into it, into like where at least the exciting and hard and sort of next level stuff happens. Like, okay, what happens after you buy the Constitution? Well, you don't really have that figured out. Less compelling to me, but yes, I think you're right. And also there's like I love seeing these projects that are pushing things forward. Constitution DAO, I mean, even Blockbuster, I don't even know what's going on with that project, but like, okay, cool. If you can get momentum, there's learning to be had there. And also that really, I don't think should be our goal or our focus. Like there's so many more bigger things to go after. And so the faster we can get into the hard work, I think the better off the space will be in general.
Yeah, I think these are templates that could be applied for many different other ends. Right now, it's like WAGBA. But yeah, I could see like it's a bit of a lesson. Like, how can you memify something else? In New York, DIY cultural institutions and venues have steadily been disappearing. I could imagine some memified campaign to say, let's buy a building, let's take it off the speculative market. It'll be run by the community. It'll never be sold. It'll be permanent. And given the like mechanisms or ways for like people around the world to easily funnel money into this project, it's pretty easy to imagine ways that this could be used for like the next iteration of being slightly more interesting or like community focused.
I agree with that. I think, there may be some people listening here, and I definitely was one of these folks at one point recently. Maybe my understanding of the cooperative movement was very limited. Being able to sort of see like there are multiple billion-dollar cooperatives that exist out there in the world, and which is shocking to me to learn about, but it's usually in agriculture or, I think in the United States you have REI, which is a co-op. We have it here in Mountain Equipment Co-op in Canada, which is no longer a co-op, I think, which is unfortunate. But I really enjoyed how you sort of went back to the roots of what DAOs can learn from co-ops, the roots of cooperatives. And I feel like there's probably a number of things in Web3 that we just don't talk enough about because there's just such an amount of work that has gone into that we should be taking on and running with rather than trying to reinvent. And that's kind of what I took away from your section here. Like, what can DAOs learn from co-ops?
Yeah, there's a lot of practical lessons of not reinventing the same things. So just even looking at case studies, how people have practiced collective governance, how people have practiced non-hierarchical work modes. These things have been practiced and iterated on for a long time. One example is the Buy Twitter campaign, which I think was in 2017, where Nathan Schneider, Danny Spitzberg, and some other people actually organized a campaign that successfully got a shareholder resolution to vote at Twitter, introduce a study to turn it into a user-owned cooperative. Fast forward to today, I've seen at least 5 people tweet, like, let's buy Twitter. Let's form a DAO to buy Twitter. There's a website that shows all of the things that they've learned, like what are the thresholds to introduce a shareholder resolution, all of these things. So yeah, that's just one example where you don't even have to look that far and you can learn a lot. That was in 2017. But then also going back further, before cooperatives, that's the other point made in the article, is there's a history of economic and human coordination. The same spiritual space, but like far precedes what we think of like co-ops. And I think a lot of people think of hippie grocery stores when they think of cooperatives. But yeah, like citing examples, Jessica Gordon-Nimpard has cited about like in America, like early African-American economic coordination. And like that's when people were pooling money at risk of being lynched. I know mirror crowd funds are cool, but like there's some like serious history of people like pooling money together to lift each other up. So yeah, Web3 is like a really interesting next level up of like what you can do with human and economic coordination. But it's also not a tech invention and it's not a white invention either. So like those are just like important like ideas to consider. And there's just like a wide breadth of examples that I think any DAO could learn from.
Yeah, I think it's important context, and it's something that I struggle with just in the practical operation, and in that there's so much new and so much to do and so much momentum to build, and almost even positive feedback loops from sort of the new regurgitation, or at least sort of experimentation or exploration, that sort of taking the time out and stepping back and saying like, okay, how do we actually like build deep roots underneath this? How can we bring in those other insights? Can feel hard to make that shift. And I think we've just very recently put a focus at Seed Club on really trying to tap into the folks who have put a lot of thought into and work into self-management and the broader self-management movement across a number of other different topic areas as well. So I think what we're going to see is like this, as the waves of these markets sort of come and go, there's this crazy amount of expansion that can happen during the bull markets, right? So we just say last year was a bull market. And the mode there really is just to experiment, to run, to be a part of everything, to try to just go. And it becomes very, very unsustainable, as I'm sure you've probably felt yourself. I definitely felt, and I know a number of others as that sort of the year wound down. And now I'm really feeling and talking to a number of people, and that the mood as the market kind of slows and the intensity kind of dies down a little bit, for how long, I don't know, there's this like refocusing and taking the resources that have sort of been generated through that hype phase and putting it into the foundations of these organizations. That's what we're doing at Seed Club, and I see it happening across the space. So I think that's going to lead to a much more powerful evolution of the space, at least that's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, I forgot I was talking to last week, but they were like, some of the most prominent voices in this space came in the last year. And I'm talking to you on a Seed Club podcast now, and this time last year, I didn't have MetaMask, and I had never been on Discord. So like, yeah, I think there's like a cultural friction as things like become more accessible, more people with broader perspectives come in, more diverse origins or interests, what people are trying to do in the space, what people find interesting, the like use cases to point to, it's like easier to understand. Yeah, there's going to be more people getting in. And I think it's just going to like shift the culture. There's just going to be like new voices, new perspectives. Yeah, I think this time next year, who knows what the conversation will look like.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. We started off this conversation around Ampled and a platform cooperative that you're sort of co-founding and a part of building. And then we sort of transitioned into talking about co-ops and some of the challenges and benefits that kind of come from co-ops and from DAOs themselves. And I'm curious, like you sort of get into talking a little bit about the lessons or things that co-ops can take from DAOs. And I think that's actually maybe the most interesting piece here, especially as you're sort of highlighting that, like, there is a whole bunch of new voices coming in. There's probably far more people who are trying to figure out, like, how do we truly embed this sort of deep community ownership in in these platforms or in the organizations that we're building. So like, if you're talking to yourself a year and a half ago, maybe putting aside the need to understand Web3, what are the core points that you're getting across? Like, what can co-ops take from DAOs and put to work today?
I think to me, the primary one is tokens as a tool to bootstrap a network. Starting something like Ampled, a two-sided marketplace with no funding, no employees. That's really hard. Like that's a Herculean task, and it felt like just punching through a wall, especially compared to other more resource VC backed platforms. I used Helium as an example of like global long fi network to power like Internet of Things. There's so many people that are setting up routers in their homes. They get rewarded in HNT, their network governance token. And it's shocking and cool to see how much of a network that can actually build. It's big. And I think that any kind of group that's interested in scaling shared ownership, some sort of embedding of cooperative principles in a larger network, I think that like we'll just see more really impressive networks that like have used this incentive and coordination tool in a really smart way.
Yeah, I think it's core to that line, bootstrapping networks with tokens as the core value. I think if you look at the broader market, people might look at crypto generally with some skepticism around how effective that tool set can be. And then even within crypto, I think the further up the stack you go, which is like, okay, infrastructure layers, Helium is an infrastructure attempt, Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. You get up into token ownership of more platforms, so like Uniswap, maybe what Mirror will eventually look like, or Zora. I think that's increasingly becoming recognized as being a viable business, or there's value to be had there. At least I think many of our friends would agree with that. And then what we're talking about with many of these communities, maybe not Ampled, but say a Krause House or a Pool Suite, you're even further up the stack. You're representing like these communities or networks themselves, and that tokens can be mechanisms to bootstrap networks that look less tech enabled and look more social and human enabled. And I think that's super interesting. When I try to like contextualize the number of sort of logical leaps that we're going to play in the space that I think you're very involved in right now, and obviously we are here at C Club as well, I think that's interesting.
Yeah. The other, to that point of my tokens being some like platformless network in themselves, it's also interesting from the perspective of an idea space that Ampled was in. And I think a lot of people are exploring is what is the successor to the Patreon model. However twee or nice or warm and fuzzy their hero image illustrations are and their like corporate voice, you're not allowed to leave. You build an audience there and it lives on Patreon servers. What's the alternative to that? Ampled is kind of like one idea of like an alternative. So yeah, instead of VCs using it as some sort of financial arbitrage machine, like your community is driving the value of someone else's ownership. An alternative is like, well, let's just collectively own it. Let's own it together. And I think a really compelling other vision is there's just no platform. Like the community is a network. It could exist on a version of Patreon, but it's on some protocol that's also collectively owned by everyone. And that's what I see that's really exciting. Like the idea of article on hyperstructures that Jacob from Zora wrote. I'm feeling more and more compelled by like the anti-platform approach.
Yeah, I think that I'd often contextualize token ownership as like being the platformless version of a like or subscribe. Like it represents sort of this collective belief in something, but maybe the platform is Ethereum or whatever L1 you're using. But I mean, there's a lot more flexibility there as well. Being a very freeing thing and fundamental to like if the point is to build value around that community rather than to build value around the subscriber base or email subscriber or like, you end up with very different value structures and opportunities there. And I think so much of what I'm also fascinated with. I'm so glad Jacob's back into writing. He just has this brain on him that I absolutely love, and start to explore like, a platformless platform. Like what is like these hyperstructures, the components of it, the ways value might be unlocked from them. I think that that's going to be a big part of how we sort of see this sort of V1 tools that are supporting DAOs and communities emerging, because there's a whole podcast here to think through like the strategic impacts that are at play here as a number of these communities that we're part of start to really grow in economic power and impact, and can really be a force for a way of actually breaking free of some of those platform controls, where we no longer need to have to build on a Patreon. We can just go build our own. I don't know where that goes, but it gets me pretty stoked.
Yeah, I think it's something that we can feel excited about, but it's also something that not enough people see as a problem yet. I think I've been singing the song of ownership, ownership, ownership for years. It's a delicate balance because you don't want to throw shade on people for joining Patreon. Definitely wouldn't want to make someone feel like a sellout or something like that. Like there's trade-offs and compromises everywhere. And sometimes just like a reliable, well-funded utility that takes a cut is something that someone will make the choice that's worth it. But I think there should be an option for any kind of category, an option for something that you can participate in and own, something that you have the upside in, you can help shape. It still hasn't really caught on that ownership should be like a cultural value that we care about, that we prioritize over other things. It becomes important that people ask who owns it. So right now, almost no one asks that question. Ampled posted something on Instagram that was a breakdown of all the owners of Spotify, the designs of the Spotify Wrapped. We're like all the global investment banks and what their ownership shares are. Patreon, we don't know who owns it, but we know the investors, and through this many funding rounds, it's almost certainly a vast majority owned by investors. It makes sense to explain it to artists and creators to say, like, if there's ever a question that comes up where there's a friction between your interests and the investor's interests, which one do you think will win? Or do you really feel safe knowing that this could be sold at any moment to Facebook or Google? Like, these can be like uncomfortable questions for people, but they haven't fully been articulated yet as something that most people really care about. So I'd love to see that. I'm sure maybe people will care once we're all tired of talking about it. Yeah, would love to see this be like a cultural value that more people want to see and care about.
Yeah, I think the change is often driven by pain. And I think it's interesting to see how so many of the folks that are deeper into the Web3 space and talking about ownership really are creatives, they are musicians, they are folks who really felt the negative impacts of dominant networks that have no say in and no ownership in being the determiner of their financial or economic viability. And I think the more and more, like we're still so early in this, I think multi-decade transition to networks being the thing that, coordinates our economy and where people have that individual sort of touch point. And the more we get into that, the more this stuff becomes pretty obvious. So I think it's an inevitability. It's also why I'm so passionate about the work that we're doing here in the Web3 space, because I think it is one of the few viable other options. Yes, there are issues. Yes, there's a long way to go. Yes, yes, yes to all those concerns. And ultimately, what else do we have right now? And so I don't say that in sort of like a defeatist way. Like I think it's awesome that we have this option. It's never been an option before. Ownership of digital goods just didn't, in a digital world without a third party, could never exist. This is a crazy innovation. So yeah, I'm broadly optimistic about the over the long time of history that more and more people will come back to the idea of ownership being key. Okay, we're coming up on the bottom of the hour here. You'd only get one Red Bull in, so I'm sure you got a lot of other work to get into tonight. I think one of the projects that I really love seeing, I love seeing what people are experimenting with alongside whatever their day job is. And to me, DinnerDAO I remember seeing you ship this, me looking at it being like, that's a thing, man. That's very much a thing. And you're like, yeah, whatever. It's just like, whatever, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's what people who don't know they have a thing say when there's a thing. So, I mean, can you just give us like the highest level? What is DinnerDAO and like what is the most recent sort of activity happening there?
Yeah. Yeah, DinnerDAO is it's a little Web3 supper club. That's it. It seeks nothing more than to have dinners. That's it. It's a modest DAO. We're not trying to buy and operate an NBA team. We're trying to buy dinner. So, yeah, I mean, it was like a kind of like a proof of concept of membership as NFTs, playing around with that idea. It's kind of like an interest group that's interested in being playful with DAO tooling. So you buy a season pass to DinnerDAO that funding goes to like a transparent community treasury. That pass that you get allows you into private channels, into the Discord, allows you to vote and create dinner proposals. And we pay with a Coinbase debit card, and the treasury reimburses that person. Yeah, I mean, you started with 8 people in New York, and then interest has grown. So we have 40 members now. There's each is a group of 8. We have 2 in New York, 2 in LA, and 1 in Portland. And the rest of the crew is organizing season 2. I haven't taken a leadership role in this. In some ways, it's like really awesome to help push something. And then there's like a community that, I mean, we all have really enjoyed it and made great friends. And so there's people picking it and running with it and taking ownership of it. And so, yeah, it's super cool. I'm going to always be involved with DinnerDAO. I might not like always be organizing the dinners, but I'll be eating them.
I love that so much. Might not be. I'll be eating them. There's like a deeper commentary on DAOs right there, I think, that you're alluding to. Austin, yeah, I just always very much appreciated your approach and thoughtfulness and rigor in which you sort of explore the space and continue to build and experiment in and around. So it's been a pleasure having you on, sharing a little bit more about your thinking at the intersection of cooperatives and DAOs. Listen, I think early on, it was very apparent to me that you were going to be somebody who's going to lead conversations, thought, effort at that intersection point. And it's been awesome to see you really step into that role. And I'm sure there'll be many more interesting things that are going to come out, as I know you're working on a new project that we didn't even get into, but we can get into that in the future, hopefully, as we continue to work together. So thank you for hanging out with us today. Is there a place you want to send people to right now so that they can stay up to date with you, or maybe even what you're working on right now?
Yeah, also just Jess, thank you. I mean, C Club, a little commercial for C Club. It's fantastic experience. I felt like it was actually like pretty transformative being within the right room and just, feeling like you're in the right room surrounded by really smart people, kind of like with a foundation of really amazing intentions. Yeah, the team is incredible. I just think it's an amazing group. And so like very happy to be a part of the community. Yeah, so shout out Jess. And yeah, people could find me on Twitter, Austin Robey _ because Austin Robey was taken. So find me there.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for hanging out with us today, and we'll see you all on the internet.